Welcome to episode 197 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about the Beatles' debut album from 1963, Please Please Me. This is an early repress from probably around May 1963. My dad had bought Beatles records when they first came out. We lived in the northwest of England and he bought them in 1964 and 65 and so on. We had original copies of Hard Day's Night, of Beatles for Sale, and of Sgt. Pepper's. And as I became a young sophisticate, I then really gravitated towards the more kind of esoteric, challenging, interesting songwriting that really starts from Rubber Soul on. I sort of kind of wrote this era off as twee, simple, pandering beat pop, and I wasn't really that interested in it. But it's been a real revelation, actually, in recent years, coming back to some of these early records, and particularly giving this one a really thorough listen again. Beatles story is pretty well known. 1957, John and a bunch of friends form a skiffle group, skiffle being that big fad that kind of was a fusion of English and American folk traditions in the mid-1950s. They're called the Quarrymen. At a church fete, he meets Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney presses him with his musical ability, even though he's a little bit younger, and he joins the band. Paul then brings in George Harrison, the beginning of 1958. George also is kind of young. John's not so sure. Eventually, however, George basically shows he really can play guitar, so he's allowed in as well. So by 1958, early 1958, three of the Fab Four are in the band. The skiffle guys basically make their way out of the band. By 1959, there's only three members left, and that's John, Paul, and George, and they call themselves Johnny and the Moondogs. John's also going to art school in Liverpool at this time, and he meets a Scottish guy called Stu Sutcliffe, who's a much better artist than John, and actually than most people, and sells one of his paintings for quite a lot of money. And the other Beatles persuade him to buy a bass with the money and join the group. At this point, they still didn't have a regular drummer, but their manager at the time had arranged for them a several month standing gig over in Hamburg, so they auditioned for drummers, and they come up with a guy who, of course, was Pete Best. They've got a 3.5-month gig with this guy called Bruno Koschmider, who owns a couple of clubs. The Indra, where they first start playing, but they're too loud, and eventually he moves them to his second club, the Kaiserkeller. They're pretty well received, in fact so well received that they get offers from other clubs to come and play when they're not playing at the Kaiserkeller. Bruno finds out, he's pissed off, he reports George for being underage, he gets deported. Meanwhile, Paul and Pete light a condom on fire in Bruno's hallway and he reports them for arson and they get deported. So by December of 1960, only John and Stu are allowed legally to remain in Germany. Stu had met this girl called Astrid Kirchherr, who along with her friend Klaus Voormann had been coming to see the Beatles quite regularly. It's the same Klaus Voormann who actually ends up designing the coverage of Revolver. Stu and Astrid becomes a thing, and so John says, I'm going back to Liverpool, you coming? Stu says, no, I'm going to stay here with Astrid, and they end up getting engaged. The Beatles end up spending a lot of time in Hamburg over 1961 and 1962. They acquire a taste for drugs while they're there, particularly Prellies or Preludin, this upper. They'd also changed their look. Astrid had given them this haircut, which was kind of popular amongst the existential crowd, which we now know as the Beatle cut. The lineup gets a bit closer to the classic lineup of the Beatles when Stu leaves in the beginning of 1961 to go back to art school in Germany. He sadly would die a year later of a brain hemorrhage. McCartney somewhat reluctantly takes up the bass, and so from early 1961 until the middle of 62, you've got John on rhythm guitar, George on lead guitar, Paul's playing bass, and Pete Best on drums. Of course, they're not only active in Hamburg, they're spending a lot of their time back in Liverpool, where they're playing the Cavern Club now. One of the people following this whole scene was a guy called Brian Epstein, whose family owned a local record store. He met the Beatles in late 1961 and pursued them for about a month with the offer of becoming their manager, and eventually they agreed. He takes them to Decca Records, famously on New Year's Day 1962, where he's told that guitar groups are on their way out and they're not interested in signing them. But 3 months later, he does persuade George Martin at Parlophone, which was a subdivision of EMI, to sign the Beatles. The process of producing this first record is actually relatively extended. It takes about 8 months all told. They first go into EMI's Abbey Road studios in June 1962. George Martin is the producer, Norman Smith is the engineer, and Martin from the get-go is not impressed with Pete Best's drumming, and he has a word in the ear of John and Paul and says, I think this guy's got to go. So in August 1962, Pete's out and Ringo comes in on drums. They recorded the same song they'd done with Pete back in June, which is Love Me Do, but George still was not happy. So a week later, he calls them back in, only this time he's brought in a guy called Andy White, a session drummer whom he trusts, and they record Love Me Do for a third time. There were two other songs recorded that day, an early version of Please Please Me, not as fast as the ultimate release, and P.S. I Love You. They released their first single, which is, of course, Love Me Do. Initially, when it's released, it's the Ringo Starr version. Subsequent pressings are actually the Andy White version. In November, they go back into the studio to do a speeded up version at George Martin's suggestion of Please Please Me. And famously, of course, when they finished that, Martin says, "You've just made your first #1." And sure enough, it went to #1 in January 1963. They needed 10 more songs for the record. George Martin had considered going to the Cavern Club to actually record them live, but when he went to do a test recording, the sound quality was kind of crappy. So he decided to do the recording at Abbey Road, but he wanted to get the feel of a live set. So the idea was simply to do what they eventually did, is one session to record all 10 songs. It's pretty much recorded live, and on those 10 tracks, it's just the Beatles, with the exception of Martin playing in a couple of tracks. They had only a 2-track recorder, so there was very little leeway to actually do any kind of overdub. So if they wanted a piano, as they did on one track, or some other instrument, and Martin suggested a celesta on another track, someone had to play them who wasn't John, Paul, George, or Ringo, and that, of course, was George Martin. The record starts with that killer track, I Saw Her Standing There, which is a Paul composition he'd written it the previous fall with John's help. There's so much to love musically about this song. Recently, I've really been struck by Ringo's drum fills, and also in the I Saw Her Standing There part of the chorus, the way they harmonize in that raw sound in the stand syllable. Anyway, magic. Misery is next. This is the song which has George Martin on piano. I used to think this was pretty pedestrian stuff, and it's not of the same quality, obviously, as I Saw Her Standing There. Listening again to the quality of John's performance, and really, if there's one real star in this whole record, it's John and his vocal delivery. It's just remarkable all the way through. Really compelling stuff. Anna, which is by a guy called Arthur Alexander, who was a songwriter, pretty anonymous now, but he was of some repute back in the day. This is another track where John's vocal delivery takes the track a notch up from where it would otherwise be. It's also got this kind of almost comic backup vocal from George, sounding like he's in a bathroom at the end of the hall. Cover of Goffin and King's Chains is next. Interesting choice of song, kind of an interesting vocal rhythm to this song too, not quite you would expect. Well, it's not a huge highlight. Another song which is more interesting than maybe it is good follows, and that's Boys. Interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, they don't swap the gender of the singer in the song, and no real reason why they should do. It's just it would have been very conventional to have done so. The other is that Ringo sings, and this I think is a real testament to the togetherness, the solidarity of the band, because recall that Ringo was still probably under a fair amount of pressure and scrutiny. Ask Me Why follows. That, of course, had been done in the June 1962 sessions with Pete, who had then been sacked. When they came back in November, Ringo, relatively brand new at that point, steps in, again, under pressure, but performs admirably, and a whole bunch of Latin flair to his drumming. Closing out side one is the title track, and this has everything that there is to like about the early Beatles. Harmonies, chunky guitar riffs, falsettos, lots of oohs, hooks aplenty, and an incredibly catchy melody. Side 2 starts with Love Me Do, and this is the Andy White version, not the Ringo version. You can tell it's the Andy White version because you can hear Ringo playing a tambourine, which is what they gave him to do. P.S. I Love You is the other Andy White track on here. This is Paul's first chance to shine since the very first opening track I Saw Her Standing There. Baby It's You is next. This is a Shirelles cover, and John, of course, in particular, was really keen on U.S. girl groups at the time. It's a pretty syrupy song, but I think John's vocal delivery, as with so many other potentially low points in this record, really takes it up to a higher level. On Do You Want to Know a Secret, George takes center stage. The next two songs are a little window into the two big personalities in the group, Paul and John. A Taste of Honey, beautiful pop. I actually really dig this. And then There's a Place, which is John's song. It is easily the most introspective song in the record and kind of a foreshadowing of where we'd get in 4 or 5 albums' time. Finally, there's Twist and Shout, and everybody knows the story about John basically doing this in one take and having shredded his voice, couldn't do it again. This was originally written by Medley and Russell, and it was originally done by a group called the Top Notes out of Philadelphia. And if you heard that record, it's pretty shitty. The notorious Phil Spector produced that shitty record, and Russell, who felt it so undersold what his content of the song was, jumped at the chance to produce it again, another version with the Isley Brothers, who introduced, amongst other things, that fantastic sort of ascending da kind of bridge which they have in the song, which of course the Beatles copied to such great effect. Music often has the power to help us time travel, and few records are better at that than this record, even if you weren't around in 1963. The energy and the excitement and the unity and the talent of this band is just spilling out of the speakers, and you're left with the idea that, you know, these guys could be onto something. If, like me, you were a bit of a later Beatles fanatic and you'd kind of turn your nose up at this sort of stuff, I recommend giving it another listen. It's pretty raw still, and not all the covers are what they might be, but the talent and the chemistry is just undeniable. For me, this is 4.5 out of 5 star record.